Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Fiber Broadband Association's Fiber for Breakfast. We're now in our 49th episode of 2022. Before we kick off, I'd like to thank Nokia, the gold sponsors for Fiber for Breakfast. Earlier this week, the Fiber Broadband Association held its premier members meeting in St. Pete Beach, Florida. And I want to thank our audience today and all our members and supporters for the tremendous success and growth of the Fiber Broadband Association over the past 2 years. FBA has nearly doubled the number of member companies during this period. Our Fiber Connect annual conference continues to grow at a record pace, and we have had sellout audiences at our regional events across the country. I'm also grateful that our Fiber for Breakfast audience is so dedicated and continues to grow. I think of these Fiber for Breakfast sessions as my weekly tutorials, and I'm so glad that so many of you are Fiber for Breakfast regulars as we learn from our wonderful expert guests each week. I'm also very excited to announce that Marissa Mitrovic has joined the Fiber Broadband Association to lead our public policy efforts. Marissa was most recently the Vice President of Federal Legislative Affairs at Frontier, and prior to that, she was the Vice President of Public Policy at Verizon, in addition to holding a number of roles on the Hill and at the administration. I hope that you all will join me in welcoming Marissa to the Fiber Broadband Association, and we look forward to her taking FBA's advocacy to the next level. Speaking of taking things to the next level, registration is open for our regional fiber workshops beginning in Raleigh, North Carolina on Tuesday, February 7th. We hope that you'll be able to join us. That brings us to today's Fiber for Breakfast session with our good friend, Lucy Moore, Special Policy Advisor at NTIA. We'll be discussing NTIA Internet for All initiative and a workforce to connect America. Before I formally introduce today's guests, I'd like to introduce Trish Ehlers from our team, who will walk us through some housekeeping items.
Thank you, Gary, and good morning to everyone who's joined us this morning. Before I go over a few logistical items, I'd like to once again thank our Fiber for Breakfast gold sponsor, Nokia. Now, if everyone would just keep in mind that you're all in listen mode only. To ask a question, you can simply type it into the question box located within your control panel on the right side of your screen. We'll host a Q&A session with our panelists at the end of today's webinar. This presentation is being recorded and will be available to members on FBA's website within 24 hours. You can find the recording in the Events tab under the Fiber for Breakfast drop-down option. At the conclusion of the presentation, you'll be prompted to complete a very brief feedback survey. If you take a minute to do so, we would really appreciate your input. I'll pass it back to Gary now to introduce our panelists and get us started. Gary?
Thanks, Trish, and good morning. I'm Gary Bolton, the President and CEO of the Fiber Broadband Association. Last week on Fiber for Breakfast, we heard from FBA's Workforce Chair, Mark Boxer, and WIA's Tim House on workforce development. The clock is ticking. In keeping with our urgent focus on workforce development, today's Fiber for Breakfast session is with NTIA's Special Policy Advisor, Lucy Moore, who will discuss their recent released workforce planning guide for states and territories to use when planning high-speed internet deployment projects in a session titled NTIA's Internet for All initiative and a workforce to connect America. Lucy Moore joined NTIA's Office of the Assistant Secretary as Special Policy Advisor focused on workforce development initiatives in January of 2022. She was most recently served as Associate Staff Secretary in the White House. Prior to joining the offices of the Staff Secretary, she worked as an appointments associate on the personnel team of the Biden-Harris transition. Lucy previously served as a policy associate for the Middle Class Economics and as co-editor of the Biden Forum at the Biden Foundation. Before joining the Biden Foundation, she served as a special assistant to U.S. Secretary Thomas Perez at the Department of Labor. Lucy received her BA from USC, a pretty good football team these days, and her master's in public policy from Harvard Kennedy School. So with that, welcome Lucy. And for audience, please type in your questions as we go, and we'll work them into the Q&A at the end. With that, let's get things started, and I'll turn it over to Lucy.
Thanks so much, Gary. I'm glad to be here and talking about a topic that's of critical importance to NTIA and to the success of our programs. So I will just jump right in. Next slide, please. So today I'm going to cover a quick summary of the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program. I know most of you are closely tracking the BEAD program, but thought it would be helpful to start with some top lines. And then we'll go over an introduction on workforce and the workforce planning guide, the requirements and guidance in our NOFOs, and some additional resources and next steps. Next slide, please. So as I said, I won't spend too much time here, but to give a quick overview, the BEAD program will provide over $40 billion for infrastructure planning and implementation. The eligible entity for the program are states, DC, Puerto Rico, and the 4 territories listed on the slide here. One thing I'd like to highlight on this slide is that workforce development and job training in support of the infrastructure workforce is an eligible use of the program funding. This slide also includes a timeline where we are right now in the BEAD program. We are in the final stages of sending all states and territories their initial planning funds. So next slide, please. I'm now going to talk a bit about how we're thinking about workforce at NTIA and at the Department of Commerce. Next slide, thank you. NTIA is proud to support the Department of Commerce's commitment to a diverse, equitable, and inclusive workforce. The Internet for All funding will play a key role in realizing a future telecommunications workforce that looks like America. These efforts will have lasting impacts on our community's economic and social well-being. Next slide. In October, we released a workforce planning guide to support eligible entities in the development of their workforce plans. Since I know you may not be able to access the link shown on this page, you can find the guide at our website, internetforall.gov. If you click on the Programs tab and go to the BEAD page, you'll find the link there. Soon we'll have a website page specifically dedicated to workforce, but that's still under construction. So the guide includes 4 main sections: components of a workforce plan, including the BEAD program requirements and guidance, developing a BEAD workforce plan, including proposed planning steps and pacing suggestions for BEAD submissions and integration with the Digital Equity Planning Grant Program, as well as strategies and examples that offer a range of approaches for meeting workforce requirements, and lastly, additional resources to support workforce planning and implementation processes. I'm now going to go into more detail on the requirements and guidance included in our NOFO and highlighted in the workforce planning guide. So industry stakeholders should become familiar with the requirements and recommendations in the BEAD NOFO related to workforce requirements. As you'll see on the slide, there are both requirements in the NOFO that are necessary for complete and successful 5-year action plans, initial proposals, and final proposals. And then there's also guidance, which is strongly encouraged by NTIA. These fall into 4 workforce categories: federal labor and employment laws, which are legal requirements that apply to all employers in the United States; skilled workforce activities, which include how employers hire, pay, and consider skilled workers and subcontractors; equitable training and workforce development activities, which offer on-the-job and professional skills development for all workers; and contracting requirements and guidance concerning direct employment and contracting, as well as partnering with minority businesses and other socially and economically disadvantaged businesses. Next slide, please. Thank you. Our first workforce component is federal labor and employment laws. As employers, BEAD subgrantees and subcontractors will be held to federal labor and employment laws. As noted here, these apply to all employers in the United States and are not particular to BEAD, but the BEAD NOFO does make explicit mention of the federal labor and employment laws listed on this slide. Next slide, please. The next workforce component is skilled workforce. Eligible entities and subgrantees must build and develop a highly skilled workforce. As part of that, they will define skilled workforce requirements and guidance for their subgrantees that will affect the telecommunications workforce and workplaces. The requirements will likely vary by state, and eligible entities should take note of their own state or territorial workforce laws. It's critical to our success that each subgrantee certifies that it will use an appropriately skilled and credentialed workforce that can complete the activities of the program. Our next workforce component is equitable training and workforce development. The equitable training and workforce development component encompasses 4 subcategories: workforce readiness, including advancing equitable workforce development and job quality objectives, such as requiring registered apprenticeships; supporting a diverse workforce, including having effective plans for outreach to historically underrepresented groups into the telecommunications workforce; outreach and engagement, including engaging with workforce-related stakeholders, such as community-based organizations; and worker protections, like coordinating and engaging with unions and worker organizations. Next slide, please. Finally, the last workforce component is contracting. Contractors or subcontractors will be subject to the workforce requirements laid out in the BEAD NOFO if they're participating in the BEAD program. In addition, eligible entities will be encouraged to contract with small and minority business enterprises, women's business enterprises, and labor surplus area firms, and we have more information on those organizations and the federal agencies that support their work in the planning guide. So I'm now quickly going to cover a couple of additional resources that are included in the Workforce Planning Guide, as well as some next steps. So the Workforce Planning Guide includes planning steps for eligible entities to take in order to prepare for the workforce demands of the BEAD program and to develop their workforce plans as required by the NOFO. I won't read through all of these listed on the slide, but some highlights where industry could help include understanding the workforce landscape, including the current needs of employers, collaborating with partners, and outlining a pathway to achieve workforce goals. The guide also includes pacing suggestions, as I mentioned earlier, for eligible entities that are consistent with the timeline for the requirements in the NOFO. Next slide, please. So this slide includes additional resources that can be found in the Workforce Planning Guide, such as points of contact with other federal and state agencies and local organizations, resources for workforce planning and understanding the workforce landscape, and a best practices checklist. The checklist is intended to help eligible entities evaluate potential workforce development programs and how they match up to what we've identified as best practices. We're soon going to be releasing case studies that offer examples using a diversity of programs to demonstrate how to use the checklist. And those will be released on an ongoing basis to include a variety of examples, but that is something to look out for in the coming weeks. Next slide, please. Finally, I want to highlight some next steps or opportunities for you to help us on these workforce goals. So we'd love for your help amplifying the Workforce Planning Guide and subsequent tools that come from NTIA on workforce development. It would be hugely helpful to share examples you know of workforce development or training programs in the field. We've been collecting these to share with eligible entities and other industry stakeholders, but since many of you are actually on the ground doing this work, I'm sure you know of examples we haven't yet identified. And lastly, we'd love to work with you on events in the states that highlight those best practices and existing programs. For example, we could invite state broadband office staff and NTIA federal program officers to job sites or training programs that exist in their states to see how the work really gets done and to talk about existing challenges that are preventing scaling of these programs. And 2 other things that aren't listed on the slide, but I wanted to highlight in terms of next steps. First, stay involved in the planning of high-speed internet programs in your states. Get to know your state broadband offices and stay in close touch with them. And next, as I've mentioned, states will need a clear picture of their workforce needs in order to properly plan for these investments. So tell states about the workforce needs you anticipate and lend your expertise on how to design effective training programs. And I think that is all the slides I have. Yeah, so thanks so much for your time today, and I'll turn it back to you, Gary, if there are any questions you have.
Thanks, Lucy. This is super interesting. So, as you've been working your way across all 56 states and territories, can you describe what you're hearing from the state broadband offices on how prepared they are for workforce? Is this a big issue for them? And where are we?
Yeah, definitely. So I would say it varies. As with all things BEAD related, states are all at different stages. They're going to face different challenges, but this is a topic that comes up all the time. I think over the last few months, states have been very focused on kind of getting through the application stage, getting their letters of intent in, and then getting their planning funds. But now that they've received, for the most part, those planning funds, they really are going to start the real work of planning for workforce development, in addition to all of the other topics that will be included in their 5-year action plans. And so it's something that we hear all the time from our state broadband leaders network and from talking to state broadband offices. And I think they could really use support from folks who are on the ground in their state, who are running training programs, who are employers, on what their needs are. And so, and I think it really does range. Some states have put together workforce plans already. Others have just started thinking about this. So it really does vary.
Lucy, as we look at, you go to each state, the challenge that we see is that you have to really do this matchmaking between the service providers who are going to need employees to get infrastructure built, the colleges or training institutes, as well as the funding, because there's a lot of moving parts. There's the NTIA BEAD money that's eligible for this funding, but then you also have Department of Labor apprenticeship money, and then there might be state money. So can you kind of make sense of how these moving parts should come together, or what, how you envision it?
Yeah, so we are trying to work together with our federal agency partners. We're in regular communication with the Departments of Energy and Transportation and other departments that are deploying infrastructure funding, as well as the Department of Labor, which has something called the Good Jobs Initiative, which is their kind of effort from the Department of Labor to coordinate this infrastructure spending across the federal government, and offers kind of technical assistance in how to be thinking about ensuring that good jobs are created through these programs. But it is a lot of moving parts. There are many different kind of funding pots available. And so we are trying to provide technical assistance to states as well, where we can, on how to be thinking about this and what funding sources might be available for different training programs. So we're always happy to kind of be in close touch with folks as questions arise.
So when you think about, when I talk to the state broadband offices, they're looking at, $42.45 billion, and then they're mapping, looking at their FCC maps and say, how do we take our allocation and get as many people connected as possible? But from, the first part, should they be looking at how to, am I going to fund and get my workforce out there? Because it appears that if you don't have the workforce, you're going to be very efficient on your deployment, and you're saying that it's going to run up your cost, right? So you need to be able, and so you have to be able to get that workforce trained and out there before the money comes. So if we look at the money, you'll do the allocations next June, and then the money should start flowing about a year from now, the first 20%. So they really only have a year to get the workforce in place.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that's why it's so critical to have this workforce focus in the development of both the 5-year action plans and then the initial and final proposals, because, what states have to say is both how they're going to use their money to reach that goal of 100% access to high-speed internet, but also how they're going to have the workforce to make that happen. And so those questions can't be answered in isolation. They have to be answered together. And that's why we're kind of really making a concerted effort on the workforce piece, because, we can do all the planning in the world, but if we don't have a skilled, diverse workforce ready to go when shovels are in the ground, it really, we won't have succeeded.
So, if I look at just the fiber, so I mean, you look at a lot of different job codes, but if you just look at the fiber job code, so we're seeing that we need over 200,000 fiber optic technicians across the country to get the BEAD, all the fiber deployed for the BEAD program. And so if we're going to get 200,000, so we've entered into a partnership with the WIA because they have a really good TIRAP apprenticeship program with Department of Labor. We also entered an agreement with the Communication Workers of America. So we're also helping with their apprenticeship. But so our job is to go, and we have the program up and ready to go. We have to go to every state. We have to find beachhead schools, and so each beachhead school, like a community college, we have to train their trainers, and then we have to also set up a partnership. So we have to seek out service providers in every state that will be able to accept those students as apprentices to be able to go into their workforce. So so there's a lot of things that have to happen. One, the states won't get their allocation until a year from now, but they do have up to $5 million. Should they start with their $5 million, knowing it's not coming out of the planning part of their funding, but know that they can use that as seed money to get this going? Is that the way they should look at it? Or?
Yeah, I think, again, not to kind of be too repetitive, but I do think it will vary for states on how they want to use that $5 million in planning funds, or however much they're receiving in planning funds. But this is, workforce readiness is one of the things that we've listed as an eligible use of that funding, and as well as kind of training up the state broadband office staff itself. And I think one of the things that you mentioned that really resonated is these train the trainer programs. We have heard that over and over again, that one of the biggest challenges is in setting up a training program is finding experienced trainers to teach students. And so that's something that I would definitely recommend thinking about early, because it will be necessary. But yeah, I think preparing for the workforce needs is one of the things that we recommend states thinking about as early as possible.
Yeah, and certainly, we all do train the trainer in Raleigh in February, and then again in Oklahoma City, and throughout our regional events. And we certainly will work with every state to help get their community colleges or wherever they want trained. And the way we look at it is start with a beachhead school in the state that can get up and going, and then they can be able to train other schools in the state, and so that they can be able to hit all the underserved areas to make sure that those are the areas that need people trained. So what are you seeing as far as where are we going to find these workers? So, if we look at the telecommunications industry, it's pretty much an aging industry. We see a lot of retirees now, especially with COVID and so forth. What is the NTI doing anything to try to recruit, or what should states do to identify potential candidates for the workforce?
Yeah, I think, one of the things that we've been encouraging is, to your point about the kind of aging workforce, is for folks to think beyond kind of the current landscape of the telecommunications workforce, which, according to the data, is overwhelmingly male, it's overwhelmingly white in the workforce. And so how can we be thinking about, representing these jobs as jobs for women as well, for people of color? And both, I think that's a kind of outreach and kind of public campaign side of, how can you include diverse faces in your marketing materials for training programs, things like that. But then also working with community-based organizations that are in the states, in the local communities that have access to that kind of talent pipeline, whether it's there's a kind of women in trades organizations, tradeswomen organizations, or a community-based organization that works with a certain ethnic group in the area and knows who's looking for a job. Kind of how you can think beyond the traditional workforce landscape, and then also thinking about younger students, whether it's high school or even earlier than that, and how we can make sure that high school students are learning about these opportunities from their college, I guess they're called student counselors or that are talking to them about different college opportunities, and are they also hearing about, you know, the non-four-year college pathways? And I certainly didn't hear about telecommunications as an option when I was in high school, and so how we can change that for longer-term success of the industry and making sure that we have a pipeline of workers. So those are things that we're recommending to states, and in the guide we have a number of examples of different types of programs that work on that recruitment side, and we really tried to include examples from a diversity of states that are both geographically diverse and that work in red and blue states. So we really think that there are ways to do this that work in a variety of different settings.
Yeah, I mean, we were really excited with our pilot for our fiber optic technician training. One of the students was 17-year-old, right out of high school with zero broadband experience. Yeah. And when he finished the course, he went right into a professional position at Greenlight Broadband, and now he works there as a fiber optic technician. So, you know, it's really great that, you know, have programs such as ours, which is able to take someone off the street with zero experience and then have them come to the program and they're fully qualified to operate, you know, right out into their apprenticeship. What about as far as taking your BEAD money? Can the states provide stipends and so forth so that, you know, those, you know, there might be people that want to switch careers or want, you know, but they don't have the wherewithal to take 8, 10, 12 weeks of training and then go through an apprenticeship and so forth. Is there a way to be able to help subsidize their living and travel to get trained?
Yeah, you know, we haven't gotten into too much detail about what specifically it looks like when we say that kind of eligible entities are able to use their funding to support workforce and training. And, you know, we've left it pretty broad. And so I think as long as states can say in their plans how the money is being spent to support the deployment workforce, that's something that we'll look at. And I think I don't see why not.
Fantastic. Well, Lucy, we just really appreciate all the hard work that you and your team have done at NTIA to really, I mean, this is to us the #1 issue, you know, if we're going to get be successful in having this infrastructure deployed across the nation and really make an impact for generations to come. We got to have the boots on the ground to make this happen. So again, just really appreciate everything that your team is doing at NTI to make this happen. And so thank you for that. And thanks for joining us today. I want to thank our audience for joining us today. And I hope that we can get back together next Wednesday. We're going to be getting together with Calix's new president and CEO, Michael Weening, on his new role in the company and his perspective on the evolution of the industry. So you won't want to miss that. So look forward to seeing you guys next Wednesday. Thanks, Lucy, and we'll see you guys soon.
Thanks, Gary.